desperately lost.
Hey, good morning. Welcome to Faith on Hill's online Sunday morning service. We gather every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m., both online and in person. Now, last week, we didn't have an online service. The week before, we didn't have an in-person service. We had one or the other, but for the last couple of weeks, it's been a little bit of a juggle. 2 weeks ago, no in-person service because of some of the construction projects that have been going on, and I'll give a little update on that in a minute. And then this last week, no online service because I had a concussion and I was recovering. And so usually I record the online Bible study on a Thursday, and I had a meeting come up. So I said, oh, it's all right. I'll just record it on Friday. And then Friday I got the concussion, and I spent most of the weekend in a dark room recovering. And Sunday morning I came to church, and it was really chill service. I taught, but I still had a lot of headache and fatigue, and so I went back home afterwards and went back to the dark room and just kept recovering. By Monday, Tuesday, I was pretty good, and I've been fine ever since. But that's why we didn't have an online service last week. So that was that. Now, in terms of our construction projects that have been going on around the church, I wanted to give this update about what's been going on with the construction projects, with the county permits, all of that. Now, some of you know that a year ago, we were going to get these projects done. Now, here's what happened. And this is the short version. But a year ago, Scopos Christian School that rents are from our building, they contracted with a fella who was going to be the point person, and it's still unclear to me exactly how this all worked, but he worked with the county previously and at some point had worked for the county, and so he was going to be the point person on getting us through the whole permitting process since he knew the system so well. He was going to get all the permits lined up, all the contractors lined up, everything was going to, so that we just had the smoothest process to get everything done. And then we were told, hey, we're ready to go. We just need like 2 more permits issued and we'll be good to go. And you might remember a year ago in the summer, we dug up our whole frontage up on the street to get ready for that. And then we found out that that guy had done nothing and had been scamming Scopos, and everything got put to a stop. And so the lawyers had to get back involved because we had to say, hey, we had worked out this timeline with the county of when we were going to get things done. And then we had to come and say, hey, we were defrauded. And there was at the same time, the person we had been working with the county had retired, and there was a new person, and that person just did not like us for some reason. And I can't assign any reasoning for it, but they didn't. And so they wanted to stop the whole process and shut the whole thing down. And so the lawyer had to get involved, and then we had to work on this thing. And that's why there's been this long delay. And then finally we got everything permitted. Everything's been done over the summer. We finally got the sidewalk pour done. It looks good. It's looking like, all right, everything's clear. And last Monday, we got our provisional permit and everything's good. But the reason it's provisional and not final is they gave us a list of 22 things that they wanted us to do. Now, you might think, hey, we have been working with the county for years on this project. How is it there are 22 brand new things that they want us to do? We asked that too. Now, we looked at the list, and some of them are really small things that we can get done. That's no problem. But some of them are kind of on the ridiculous side, and so we're trying to figure out how we're going to deal with that. So you can pray for us, for the leadership of Scopos, as we're trying to figure these things out. The biggest, in terms of cost, is they're trying to say that some of our doors are not fire rated. They're not fire doors. Now, when those doors were installed years ago, Dave Centers knows a thing or two about fire, and he knows that they were installed, those doors were chosen to be fire rated. We had an architect come through when this project was first being worked on a few years ago, and one of the things that he noted is, those doors are fire rated. We don't have to do anything about those doors. The fire marshal has never raised that as an issue. Why is it that all of a sudden this is something that the county is saying? we're trying to work on that. So I'm just giving you a sense of like some of these things aren't big deal things, but then out of nowhere, after years of having inspections and working with the county, there's this massive thing they're coming at us with. Why now? Why here? So pray for us that we would have wisdom, that we would have favor, that God would deliver us, because the cost of putting in new fire doors to replace our current fire doors would be significant. So that's what's going on. We have done everything the county's asked. We have done quite a bit of work. And so now we're just praying that the Lord would give us clarity about this new list that the county's given us the end of the year to complete. So that's what's going on. Anyway, we appreciate everybody who has been with us through this whole process, and we just keep moving forward. Now, I do want to say that today, Judges 19 is considered possibly the worst story in the whole Bible. And I want to give a trigger warning. It deals with rape. It deals with the abuse of women. We're going to talk about people who have been abused or unsafe within the church. There's a lot of things that could be triggering to people, and I wanted to give you a heads up about it. It deals with violence and just things that could be rough for people. And so if you're just like, you know what, this week I'm going to skip it, you know what, that's okay. Feel free to do as you feel like you need to do. But I wanted to give a trigger warning and a heads up. This is considered the worst story in the whole Bible for a reason. And so just so you know, that's what we're getting into. Judges chapter 19. Judges chapter 19, verse 1 says, "In those days, Israel had no king." This was not speaking of a political king. Israel wasn't supposed to have a king. God was supposed to be their king. They were supposed to be the children of God. They were supposed to be people in a covenant relationship with God. God said, "I will be your God. You will be my people. You will serve me, and I will provide for you. You will keep my ways, and I will defend you." But they did not follow him. They did not listen. The people of Israel who came out of Egypt made this covenant with God at the foot of Mount Sinai. They agreed to it. God reestablished the covenant with the people of Israel when they crossed into the promised land. They crossed over the Jordan River, and they reestablished that covenant then. At the end of Joshua's life, he gathered the people together at the tabernacle at Shiloh. And he said, "Hey, it seems like you don't want to keep this covenant. Your tents and your houses are full of idols, the gods of the local people, the gods of the people whose lands we have taken, the gods of the people from east of the river," meaning the gods that our ancestor Abraham rejected and left and came to this land to follow Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Bible. He said, "If you don't want to follow Yahweh, then go your way. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And the people responded, "No, we want to follow Yahweh. We want to stay in his covenant." And so Joshua said, "Hey, fine. Get rid of your idols. Get rid of your foreign gods. Get rid of your false gods. Turn away from this evil that you are practicing in secret." And they said, "No, we're going to follow God." And then we see in the book of Judges that they did not get rid of their idols. They did not turn away from the pagan practices of the world around them. And in fact, they gave themselves over to it. In those days, Israel had no king. F.B. Meyer, who was one of the most respected Bible commentators of the previous generation and somebody who I still give great weight to whenever I see a quote from him, he said something I don't agree with, but I understand his thought process. F.B. Myers essentially said, you don't have to read Judges chapter 19. Now, if I put earlier here a trigger warning, Judges 19 deals with rape, gang rape, sexual violence, deals with mob violence. It deals with people who are unsafe among the people of God. There are all kinds of triggering things here, and there are people for whom it would be rough right now in the place they are at in their life to read Judges 19, and I totally understand that. But F.B. Myers was speaking for all people, and he said that it would be sufficient for us to just read these words, "In those days, Israel had no king." It would be sufficient for us to just meditate on those words and leave the rest alone. That it is such a horrific story that you don't have to read on. It is sufficient to know that in those days, Israel had no king. They had rejected God and his rule and his authority. And you can imagine how bad things get when that happens. However, those aside, and again, if somebody is triggered because of past trauma that they have experienced, I have nothing but understanding and grace. But for the average, for most people, right, they're in a place where they can come to these things, and we should see what is going on. I had to have a really frank and honest conversation with my children this week about the reality of the home lives of many people they go to school with. What is it like to live in the homes of many kids that you are around? Because they have lived what could arguably, far less sheltered than I've lived, but as a kid, but arguably still a sheltered life. They've been protected. They haven't been exposed to drug use. They haven't been exposed to sexually explicit content. They haven't been exposed to drunkenness. They haven't been abused. They haven't been neglected. They haven't experienced trauma. They haven't experienced all of these things that are traumatic to children. But you need to know. And it says, in those days, Israel had no king, but a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Now, a concubine we would call them a partner, right? It's more than a boyfriend or a girlfriend, less than a spouse. A life partner, somebody who you have decided to commit to build your life with, somebody who you are with exclusively. You live together. You are functionally married in all ways except the legalities. But, verse 2, she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem, Judah. And after she had been there for 4 months, her husband went to persuade her to return. And he had with him his servant and 2 donkeys. And she took him into her parents' home. And when her father saw him, he gladly welcomed him. And his father-in-law, the woman's father, prevailed on him to stay, so he remained 3 days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. Now, we don't know exactly why the author chose to make it clear that they were not married, that she was his concubine, not his wife, and then refers to him as her husband and to her father as his father-in-law. We're unclear exactly as to why that is. There's different theories that I read. Some person's convinced, well, this is the cultural reason why. But, everybody's got their thing, and it's their pet theory that they wrote their master's or their doctoral thesis on, and then they write a Bible commentary based on their thesis. And of course, they're going to say that with some adamancy because it's what their whole PhD or MDiv or whatever is based on. I would just say it's interesting. The bigger point to me is that this idea is she was unfaithful to him, meaning that she was cheating with somebody locally. And when it was found out, instead of working to fix things, she goes back home and hangs out with her dad and her dad's family. And so after 4 months, he's like, I want to try to get her back. And so he goes and he tries to win her back. And her father-in-law's, great, welcome. And we don't know exactly why. Maybe it's that, there's sometimes we get really theoretical, or we get really kind of high in our thinking of, he welcomes her back because he wants what's best for her and he's trying to bring them back together. Maybe he was just oh, I finally got rid of her. Oh my goodness. And now she's back in the house and, good, come get her off my hands. Maybe it's something as simple as that. And you think that's not real, but I've known situations like that. That to me is the more real thing than something high and romantic or noble. The less noble thing The more dysfunctional thing seems to be the more probable thing in this story. So anyway, he's like, hey, welcome back. Why don't you hang out for a few days? So they just barbecue for like 3 days. They have, they're eating, they're drinking. He's hanging out there. He's basically like, hey, I want these guys to like get back in a good place. So they're hanging out. Everybody's doing good. On the 4th day, it says they got up early, they prepared to leave, but the woman's father said to the son-in-law, hey, refresh yourself with something to eat, then you can go. So the two of them sat down to eat and drink together. But afterwards, the woman's father said, please stay tonight and enjoy yourself. But the man got up to go. His father-in-law persuaded him, so he stayed there that night. In the morning of the 5th day when he rose, the woman's father said, hey, refresh yourself, wait till the afternoon. So the two of them ate together. And then when the man and his concubine and his servant got up to leave, his father-in-law, the woman's father, said, now look, it's almost evening. Spend the night here. The day's nearly over. Stay and enjoy yourself. Early tomorrow morning you can get up and be on your way home. But unwilling to stay another night, the man left and went towards Jebus, that is Jerusalem, with his 2 saddled donkeys and his concubine. So basically, the father-in-law just kind of figures out he likes partying with this guy. That's what it comes down to. The father-in-law has figured out that he likes partying with this guy. For whatever reason that he invited him to stay in the first place. Maybe it was like, hey, you know what? People tend to fight on road trips, and that's just kind of true. So let's just have them hang out, kind of rebuild a little relationship, rekindle a little romance. They're in a good place, then they'll go back home. But he figures out he likes partying with this guy, and so he's having him hang out. And then when the guy finally leaves, it's almost evening, the sun is almost setting. That is a dangerous time to go on the road. And the father-in-law says something that is wise. Don't leave yet. Leave in the morning. But because trust has been broken, right? There is no reason to trust this guy. Every time they try to leave early in the morning, the father-in-law is like, nah, hang out and stay. He has broken all trust. So when he finally says something that is worth listening to, nobody will listen to him. I've known things like this. There's this whole thing about like, it's biblical. Honor your father and mother. And I've had parents over the years. I was a youth pastor for a long time. And I've had parents over the years when I was a youth pastor and still to this day as a lead pastor, that people will come and they'll say, hey, my kid's not listening to me. I'm trying to tell them this. And there have been occasions where I've said, you're trying to tell them the right thing. But what have you told them before? Have you broken relationship so that you're at the point when you are finally trying to say something good, important, necessary, that they won't listen to you? This could extend to the church, by the way. There are Christians and churches who for years have spouted nonsense, and then when they finally want to say something good, true, holy, important, nobody listens to them. There's somebody I know who spends all of their time on social media posting things that I would just quantify as nonsense. And I won't say what they are just to not bias you one way or the other. But then for every 20 to 30 things of nonsense that they post, then every so often they will post something that is about the gospel, that's correct, that's right. And I've privately said to them, why is it that for every 30 things that you post about this other stuff, and then you post a gospel thing, why isn't it 30 gospel things for one of this other kind of thing? Why is it that these 30 things that will totally take, even if you believe all of those things fully, you agree with me that they diminish your credibility with the world around you? And I'm talking like flat earth level stuff. Like, the earth is, there are people who still believe that the earth is flat. And that's the kind of nonsensical stuff I'm talking about. And then you post something that is true about Jesus, but you've posted 30 things about the earth being flat or equivalent. How do people trust you? The father-in-law, for days now, every time they've tried to do the right thing, the responsible thing, get up early in the morning, he said, nah, don't do it. Hang out. And then finally he's like, we got to go, man. We got to get out. And now he's trying to say the right thing, the responsible thing, and they aren't going to listen. So they do. They go set out. They go towards Jabus, which is where Jerusalem is. And they head out. The day was almost gone, verse 11. And the servant said to his master, "Come, let's stop at this city of the Jebusites and spend the night." But his master replied, "No, we won't go into any city whose people are not Israelites. We will go to Gibeah." At that time, Jerusalem was not under the control of the people of Israel. They had not taken it, even though it was within the lands that God had given them. So they said, "Hey, we're going to go to God's people. That's where we'll be safe." So they went on to Gibeah. And as the sun set, they neared Gibeah in Benjamin. And they stopped to spend the night in the square. And they went and sat at the city square, but no one took them in for the night. This is seen all throughout the Old Testament. An ancient city with either wood or stone or mud brick would have a sort of a basic wall where the houses or huts would be built inside, and there would be a city gate where the elders of the city would sit throughout the day so that the city business could be conducted, and a traveler would come into the city gates. And the city elders might say, "Where are you coming? Where are you going?" And you'd say, "Oh, I'm coming from here and I'm going to there. I'm just going to stay here for the night." And it was expected that you would offer hospitality to a traveler and you would take them in. Now, many larger settlements would actually have an extra little hut set up for travelers. And "Oh, hey, we've got a guest house over there. Just go set up over there. You're good." Or one of them would say, "Hey, just come to my place. I've got an extra spot for you." No one did. And after being there, and no one offered them the expected hospitality, we can't fathom this, right? Because that's not our system. It's not our culture. Like, it's really hard. I've been learning Spanish for a while, and I am around Spanish speaking all the time. It's really hard for me to understand usted, the need for the formality usted. And I have to remind myself to use the formal usted because I just don't understand it. "Hey, how are you doing?" We just use you for everybody, but it's very important in Spanish, if you don't know the person, to use usted, this formality. The idea of using the informal tu, "Hey, how are you doing?" is very informal, is like very, "Whoa, what are you doing?" And you see this like in old Jane Austen kind of movies where like to use somebody's first name, it's always Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bingley. You never use their first name because that is a very personal thing. To speak of somebody by their first name is something reserved for only your closest acquaintances, relatives, friends, spouses, and even in very personal moments. But we can't fathom that because we don't have that kind of system of formality. But we have to understand that this inhospitality is unheard of, unthinkable. It is a shame for any Jewish person reading this story or any person of the ancient world to hear this story. It would be a shameful, horrific, unthinkable thing. And yet no one took them in. And that evening, verse 16, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim who was living in Gibeah, the inhabitants of the place were the Benjamites, came in from his work in the fields, and when he looked and he saw the traveler in the city square, the old man asked, "Where are you going? Where did you come from?" So he asked the question that somebody else should have already asked. And he answered, "We are on our way from Bethlehem in Judah to a remote area of the hill country of Ephraim where I live. I have been to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I am going to the house of the Lord. No one has taken me in for the night. We have both straw and fodder for our donkey, and bread and wine for ourselves, your servants. Me, the woman, and the young man with me, we don't need anything." So what he is saying is, hey, we're not even trying to be a burden. You don't have to feed us. You don't have to take care of us. If somebody had come and said, "Oh, you know what, I'd like to house you, but I don't have any extra food tonight. I don't have enough straw or hay for your animals." He said, "Hey, we're not a burden to anybody. We've got all the stuff." The man said, "You're welcome to my house. Let me supply whatever you need. Only don't spend the night in the city square." So he took them into the house, and he fed his donkeys, and after he had washed their feet, they had something to eat and drink. And while they enjoyed themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surround the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came with you into your house so that we can have sex with him." The owner of the house went outside and said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile. This man is a guest. Don't do this outrageous thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But as for this man, do not do such an outrageous thing." But the men would not listen to him, and so the man took his concubine and sent her outside. One translation I read put it more bluntly, he pushed her outside. And they raped her and abused her throughout the night, and at dawn they let her go. And at daybreak the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, and she fell down at the door and lay there until daylight. When her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, "Get up, let's go." But there was no answer. The man put her on his donkey and set out for home. When he reached home, he took his knife and cut up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them all to all the areas of Israel. 12, so one for each tribe. Everyone who saw it was saying to one another, "Such a thing has never been done or seen, not since the days that the Israelites came up out of Egypt." Just imagine. We must do something, so speak up. What a horrible story. And if you said this idea of him cutting up his concubine into 12 parts, there's no social media, there's no news. This is grotesque and horrific, but he cuts up her body into 12 parts and with messengers sends one part to each tribe's leaders, including the Benjamites. He sends one part of the body to each 12 tribes leaders to say, "This is what happened to a woman of the people of Israel at the hands of her fellow Israelites. This is what happened." The family was broken in Israel. The Levite was living outside of God's plan. And you might say, "Adam, that had nothing to do with what happened to the woman," and that is true, but it's also linked. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's linked. I mean that things don't happen in a vacuum, right? Things don't happen in a vacuum. Do you think that we're having a mental health crisis in our community just on its own? Do you think that just happened one day? Or is there a link to some other things that are happening in our community? Do you think that the drug use in our community feeds into the mental health crisis and the mental health crisis feeds into the drug use in our community? Do you think that the abuse that we see of children and the vulnerable in our community feeds into the mental health crisis and the drug use, and both of those things feed back into the abuse of children and the vulnerable? There is a link. When I first became the pastor at this church in 2017, there was a person in the church who was in a leadership position, and within just a few weeks of my becoming the pastor, it was found out that they were engaged in very, very significant sin. And there was a big whoa, and there had to be talk among leadership, and I had to talk with the superintendent and the whole thing. But let me say this. Now, I will say, I feel very, very proud of how our church handled that entire matter. And I feel like we upheld biblical truth while at the same time being gracious, and we still have relationship with the person, and they still are welcomed, and I know that they are welcomed in our church. And I could not be more proud of how our church, our leadership, and everybody dealt with that whole situation. But I want to be blunt. and say this, that for everybody who is like, oh my gosh, my pearls, this is happening. There was also, as I kind of realized over the next 6 months, a different prevalent sin in our church. And by the way, those people kind of just moved on their own as the Bible was taught, and they just left on their own. But there was a different widespread prevalent sin in the church. And it wasn't surprising to me that one person was over here with this sin because this other sin was known and never dealt with. And so the idea that the family was broken because the Levite was living outside of God's plan and nobody was batting an eye about it, and it wasn't just in one place, like he's up in Ephraim, his concubine is from Judah, the father-in-law doesn't care, they get down there, it seems like they're just drinking all day for like 5-6 days straight. Then he goes up to Gibeah. The Gibeonites, they're living outside of God's plan because a mob of their young men come to rape the guests. The older men in the story, right? Shouldn't the father-in-law have, instead of just partying with the guy, been speaking truth into their lives and speaking God's love and his plan into their lives? But he did not. The older man, yes, he showed hospitality, but so he was better than his neighbors, but at the same time, was he better than his neighbors? Because he was willing to take his daughter out to the crowd and say, hey, rape her instead. What a horrific thing to say. Nobody is good here. The family is broken. From the Levite to the Gibeonites to the older men, everyone is broken in this situation. It's not good on any point. Hospitality is broken. Now, again, it's hard for us to process this because we don't have this sort of system of hospitality set up. But what it means is that the system, like society itself, was starting to break down. No one offered the travelers shelter. And they didn't even have a reason or excuse. They can't say, well, they should be able to pay their way. They could. And then once that hospitality was offered, it was broken by the mob. The systems, the social safety nets, all of the things that were set up by God and that weren't just divinely for Israel alone, but were commonplace all throughout the Middle East at that time, were broken. The family is broken. The community is broken. The tabernacle was broken. The priest, what does he say to the old man? I've been down in Judah. Now I'm going home and I'm going to the house of the Lord. I'm a Levite and I'm going back to the tabernacle. But the priest was not keeping the law. Instead of marrying, as was God's plan, he was living with a woman not his wife. The people weren't keeping the law. The servant of this Levite rightly knew that the city of the pagans was at that moment safer than the people of God were. Everything was broken. And if you think that this story sounds familiar, it's because it does. This story sounds familiar because the author is purposely writing it and framing it in a way that compares to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. This story is purposely humbling the people of Israel. Because think about their history. Abraham is called out of the world, the pagan world, to follow God in his ways. And then Abraham's nephew Lot goes back into the pagan world, but he's still considered righteous and among the people of God. And so God sends these angels to pull him out before judgment comes. And the writer of Judges here is saying, hey, you think that you're better than them. You think that Sodom and Gomorrah were the bad people and you're the good people. You think that they're the heathens and you're the holy people. And yet, what you see here is actually worse. Why is it worse? Because the people of Sodom and Gomorrah did not raise their hands against their own people. They protected the family. They only victimized travelers. The people of Gibeah, they were attacking their own people, which would have been significantly worse in that culture. And you may say, well, I don't see how it's worse. It's like every human is valuable. Sure. But every one of us lives in a cultural framework. And so if we can understand the rules of that culture and then understand, hey, this is within the framework of that culture and they are willingly breaking it, and a original reader of this text would have understood that and been horrified and been humbled by it. And that's what the author is trying to do, is trying to get the people of Israel to see at this point in our history, we were no better. In fact, we were worse than the world around us from which God called us out and separated us and said, I will be your God and you will be my people. There was no king in Israel because we had rejected God's rule and we had become worse than the heathens. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Corinth and says, hey, there is a sin that is going on in your church that is not even seen among the unbelievers. He's saying, hey, you think that the Romans and the Greeks and their culture is bad, and it was. But there's a sin going on in the church in Corinth right now that is not even allowed among them. There is a sin going on among the unbelievers that's not even allowed among them. We should be equally humbled because we are broken. How many stories do we have to hear? How many stories do we have to hear of people who have been hurt, abused in churches for somebody to say enough is enough? How many stories or times or whatever? This last week in the news, Diddy, I still can't think of him as anything else than Puff Daddy, was indicted. And when I was in high school, he was one of the biggest rappers there was. And then he leveraged that into becoming a media mogul, a business empire, riches, building the careers of others and then profiting off of them. And of course, he's indicted for human trafficking. And all of the stories that have been floating around him for years are now showing to be true and correct. And people might say, oh, well, that just shows that, the worldly people out there and the media and in Hollywood and in New York and those rappers, they're all just doing the sinful things that they've been rapping about. And Diddy's freak-off parties, that just proves everything we've ever thought, right? Here's the thing. One of the most prominent pastors, and I'm just going to say that, one of the most prominent pastors, church leaders in America in the last 40 years, has been linked to many of these things with Diddy. And not one thing has been done in his church about it. Not one investigation. It's been just statement, denial, move forward as if nothing had happened. And over again, we hear about these things. That there is a whole thing going on in the largest denomination in America, the Southern Baptist Church, because people who were reporting abuse by leaders, they report the abuse and it was covered up. And it wasn't always senior pastors. That's the thing. It's just these pastors doing things. No, sometimes it was like there was somebody who was abusing people and then they were a friend of the pastor, so they covered it up. Somebody who was bullying people in the church, but they were a friend of the pastor's wife, so it got covered up. Somebody they weren't molesting people, but they were, it was like this almost emotional abuse, just a constant beat down. You're never good enough. There's always a Bible verse telling you how you're not good enough, and they're taking things out of context and they're using Bible verses as weapons. And people have these horrific stories of emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and yes, sometimes sexual abuse in the church. And like the servant telling the Levite, hey, we should stop here among the Jebusites because we'll be safer there than we will among our own people in Gibeah. Now, I said last week, or the week before, that I have found that more often than not, people are safer in the church than they are among the world. And I still believe that. But I'm not going to deny what is also happening, that there are times and places and seasons where we should acknowledge and be humbled, just as they were trying to humble Israel with this story. And this breakdown that we see in Israel is the low point. It is the worst story in the Bible for a reason. And it is a call to repentance. It's a call to take things seriously. It's a call to say, you know what, we have to, as for me and my house, as Joshua said, we will serve the Lord. Can't control what anybody else does, but we can control what we do. And the people of Israel will respond, and next week we'll see their response. But we should know this, that when the systems break down, there are consequences. Things don't just happen in a vacuum. When people turn away from God, when people reject Jesus as king, it doesn't just, oh, well, we'll just figure out what happens in the end. It affects the world around us. And when Jesus is not king, in our lives, then everything else is affected by that. And here, there was no king in Israel because they had rejected God. And this was a horrific example of what happened because people had rejected God in their life. This is a heavy story. Now, fortunately, you know what? We're almost done with Judges. This is the heaviest story. Like I said, it's the worst story in the Bible. And fortunately, we're going to get on to brighter days after this. But you know what? Sometimes we have to just face the truth, face the reality. It's a heavy thing to deal with, but sometimes it has to be dealt with. So I appreciate everybody who's been here with us this morning. I know it's not a fun thing to talk about, not an exciting thing to talk about, but it's something for us to pray about, to ponder, and to say, Lord, help us, have mercy on us who are sinners. God bless you. We'll see you this week in the small groups. If you need a link to our online small group, email smallgroups@faithonhill.com. We'd love to see you, love to connect with you, and we'll see you next Sunday at 10:30 a.m.
We needed rescue in hell. We were the long forgotten. We were the disregarded.